radiological data?
My name is Dr. Ahimsa Sumchi. I was a physician specialist with the San Francisco Department of Public Health for many years. And most significantly, I was an attending physician in charge of the Hirsch Agent Orange Ionizing Radiation Registry for the Palo Alto Veterans Administration. The VA hospitals have the nation's largest toxic registry, and in that capacity, in 1997, I interviewed veterans who we call the atomic veterans, the veterans who were among the 5,000 personnel on the ships, the target ships in Operation Crossroads. Additionally, in 2001, as an elected member of the Restoration Advisory Board of the Point Shipyard, I founded the Radiological Subcommittee. I contributed to all 3 iterations of the historical radiological assessment, and I have played a enduring role in oversight and review of radiological issues at the Hunters Point Shipyard. I'm going to be, can I go forward in the presentation? Or?
Yes, please.
Okay. I'm going to be offering you a multimedia presentation. I was an attending physician also with the Stanford Life Support Training Center. I was working with adult learners who were often dealing with learning in situations that were emotionally charged. And one of the things that I learned from that experience is that multisensory education works. If people see it and they feel it and they smell it and they taste it, then they're most likely to understand it. So we're going to start with a 7-minute video short, and I'm sure that this video is going to have a great impact on you because it is going to impress upon you some of the very, very real human impacts of residential development on a Hunters Point, on a federal Superfund site. The name of the video is Toxic Land.
There's a natural beauty, and then there's what has been created. What it is the place that has captivating views, wonderful texture to it.
You feel really strange, or kind of like, I don't know, you step out and it just feels different. There's no life to it.
Bayview Hunters Point, a historically black neighborhood, has been home to Danielle Carpenter her whole life.
My family rooted here. My mom actually rented a house right by the shipyard. I had to be maybe 4 or 5.
But her relationship grew deeper when her husband, Chris Carpenter, started working at the shipyard in 2006.
He started in the shipyard as a laborer, and he was trained to wear protective gear the whole time, and a respirator as well. But as time went on, they didn't give them the protective gear, and they didn't give them a respirator. So Chris was always a little leery about working at the shipyard, but at the same time, they told him it was safe.
The shipyard has a radioactive history. After World War II, ships used for nuclear testing were brought back and sandblasted, causing radioactivity to spread through the air and to the soil.
As he began to work, he noticed that he started itching. We weren't sure what the itching was. It took a while for it to develop before we knew what it was. And then once it did develop and we found out, we were already at stage 4. And what they said was he had a very rare cancer, which was peripheral T-cell lymphoma. In December, he went into remission. And then in March, he passed away.
We spoke to Dr. Ahimsa Sumchi, a former physician with the San Francisco Department of Public Health, who verifies that rate of cancer in the area is high.
There has always been an inordinate and inexplicable rate of cardiopulmonary diseases in southeast San Francisco, and additionally there has been an inordinate incidence of cancers.
So how much do you attribute to loss of
goes to the shipyard?
All of it. He was healthy. He had just had a physical before he started working there. Otherwise, where would it have came from? How would it have gotten into the system?
Despite these unanswered questions, the California Department of Public Health cleared the land for development. Lennar Corporation started building houses on the property in 2014. Linda Parker Pennington bought a $900,000 condo and lives there today.
We knew that in order to be able to transfer the property over to the developer to put homes on it, it would have to pass all of the inspections and tests, and we knew that there are oversight departments that are responsible for ensuring that it was clean and ready to be tested. So we asked the questions, and they said it was clean. We didn't have concerns because we thought they wouldn't build on something that hadn't been cleaned up. I mean, that was the assumption that we made.
The Pennington family was soon to find out that their assumption was wrong. 2 years later, news broke out that employees from Tetra Tech, the company responsible for cleaning up the site, had falsified data and presented as clean when maybe it wasn't.
We felt very disappointed, scared. Everybody was pretty outraged. There were a lot of anger and a lot of, how did we get here?
All this is getting downloaded, and Oakland's in charge of making sure that each of you, when you get material, put it onto the Google Drive and in the right folders so we can find this stuff later. I need the URL for it, and I need a PDF of what you've actually found as well.
It was at this point that 22 homeowners from the neighborhood approached UC Santa Cruz scientist Daniel Hirsch to give them more transparent answers.
Most of the site has never been tested, and most of the radionuclides have never been sampled for. The irony here is that the small fraction that was tested turns out to have been almost entirely fabricated. The Navy contractor Tetra Tech has been found by the US EPA and state agencies to have fabricated 90 to 97% of the survey units. So 90% wasn't tested, 90% of the radionuclides weren't tested for, and what they did test for, they fabricated 90 to 97% of the measurements. It's really quite extraordinary.
After receiving these findings, the homeowners have filed a lawsuit against Lennar.
The lawsuit is based on loss of property value. It is not based at this point on health impact because those of us who've been here for 3.5 years don't have enough history of a health impact.
But Danielle and Chris are cautioning current residents.
Chris would definitely tell them it's not safe. Get checked. I would definitely tell people that live at the shipyard, they definitely need to stay on top of things and research.
I'm really kind of looking past the moment where we are right now because I think we're a little stuck because of this situation. But I think in the future it's going to be that envisioned, vibrant community that my son, when he comes home from college, 6 years from now, then he will come home and he will tell people that he lives at the shipyard and they will go, dang, really? That's cool.
I prepared a PowerPoint presentation for you. It's very, very creative, and as is the nature of PowerPoint presentations, we're having some technical difficulties, so we're going to give you the presentation in PDF slides. And the next presentation is called View from the Point Shipyard. Let me preface it by saying that I was a physician specialist with the Department of Public Health in 1992, on the morning of February 19th, when I went downstairs and found my father dead. My dad, George Donald Porter, was a career longshoreman and shipping clerk, walking boss at the Hunters Point Shipyard, and I am the physician of record on his death certificate. I received his medical record, and he had a chest
Question at any time.
Consistent with pulmonary asbestosis. And my dad was a real likable guy. Can you hear me okay? And he... No. Okay. Let me see. My dad was a real likable guy, a little goofy. Sometimes he was also an amateur photographer. He had archives of photos, Polaroids. Okay. He had archives of photos of Polaroids that he took. Very, very dedicated to his work at the shipyard. And for the last couple of years, I was telling my son, why don't you go down in the moat of your man cave and pull out these photos, because they could prove to be very, very valuable. And on Thanksgiving of last year, I was gifted in receiving the archives of photos. And I went through them, and one of the photos stood out to me most. I call it View from the Hunters Point Shipyard. And it has a feel to it, the composition, the simplicity. It was clearly taken by my dad from the shoreline. This is probably a cargo vessel that he was responsible for counting, the contents in. But I did want to share that photo with you, because I think that all of us feel the drift and the pull of the Hunters Point Shipyard, and that's one of the reasons why we're here. Next slide. I want to talk to you a little bit about health effects and human health risk assessments. It's one of the most important things that we need to understand, and I can hear the doorways of your brain slamming shut, but I do want to impress upon you that some of the health risk information is quite easy to interpret, and there's one major document that you can always find the best information in. The Navy has information about guiding human health risk assessments. This is the Wilson Cloud lift that was created by Schott Baker in July of 1946 in Operation Crossroads. It was caused by an underground bomb that was similar to the bomb that was dropped on Nagasaki. It's about 23 kilograms of TNT. And in addition to this huge condensation cloud that lifted the water up, and there was this hydraulic lift, it created a surge of radiation contaminated water that engulfed a number of target ships. And many of those target ships, as you know, were hauled back to the Hunters Point Shipyard. This is Building 815. The gantry crane is probably the only structure on the shipyard that is more iconic in identifying the shipyard. Building 815 consolidated the operations of the Naval Radiological Defense Laboratory. It's undergone a number of radiological investigations. This is an actual sign that was on the shipyard fence when I was a member of the RAB. And this is Christopher Carpenter, who you've been introduced to in 2015. I met with Robin Greenwald of Whites and Luxembourg Environmental Law Firm in New York City. She came all the way to San Francisco to meet with people representing Christopher. Christopher ultimately died in March of 2016 of a peripheral T-cell lymphoma, a cancer that had never been described in an African American. I know that because I researched it. In fact, I recently researched in the 2016 archives of the Department of Public Health, and non-Hodgkin's lymphomas are extremely rare in African American. Any non-Hodgkin lymphoma is rare, but peripheral T-cell lymphomas are very, very rare. And Christopher was the victim of exposure to toxic dust and numerous shutdowns in 2006 as a Parcel A worker. Next slide. So I want to backtrack. There's some information here that I think you might find mind-blowing. This is the radium dial that was discovered at the intersection of Galvez and Donahue last year. We just passed that intersection. So let's back up a little bit and talk a little bit about the radium that was in that dial. It was probably applied by thousands of young women, women as young as 14, in radium dial studios beginning in 1920. These young women used camel hair brushes, and they were told to lick the brush with their tongue to wet it, and then they would apply the radium glue to the dial. And the radium girls, as they were called, made one of the most powerful impacts on occupational health and safety in this country. Is Michelle Pierce here? Yeah, Michelle Pierce knew the history of the radium girls. I did not know it. There was one woman whose body was exhumed. She died at age 24. The United States Radium Corporation fought the radium girls when they brought lawsuits after they developed abortions and miscarriages and violent hemorrhages and died prematurely. And when they exhumed the body of one of the girls, it was glowing because radium replaces potassium and calcium in the bone. And her, her corpse was still glowing. So radium goes back to Madame Marie Curie. Madame Marie Curie was the only scientist in the world to receive the Nobel Prize twice. In 1911, she discovered radium and polonium. She was enthralled with radium. Radium has an incredible glow to it. The Black Beauty sandblast that's characteristic at the shipyard is named because of that fluorescent glow. She carried a test tube of radium in her lab coat. She died of aplastic anemia as a result of radium exposure. Her daughter also won the Nobel Prize in chemistry, and as evidence of the generational effects of radiation exposure, her daughter also died of leukemia. The radium dial that was discovered at the intersection of Galvez and Donahue, it has been minimized in its impact. I mentioned to you that the area is radiologically impacted where it was discovered. There's a building 103 that is across the street from the intersection that was used as a decontamination center for Operation Crossroads. IR-18 and IR-07, according to the HRA, are documented sites where radium dials were disposed of. And if I can have you look over here, dry docks 7, 6, and 5 are where radium dials were taken off of ships. So the point that I made when I had an opportunity to talk with you last year is that we cannot be sure that that radium dial is an isolated anomaly. We cannot be sure that it is not contiguous with the landfills that are north of it. And unless the Navy excavates the area as it is required to do so under the 2005 base-wide radiological work plan, then we can never be sure that this is not part of a landfill. The other thing that I want to do, and I'll be...
Dr. Sumchi, so let's finalize this.
Sure. I do also want to submit to the representatives of the California Department of Public Health some information that disputes the report that the potassium-40 anomalies, there were 88 anomalies that were detected, are naturally occurring. Potassium-40 is a radionuclide of concern. At the shipyard, it is one of the radionuclides that was being used by the NRDL. Potassium-40 is used commercially in photography and lithography and in many other instances. So I do want to formally submit this. I also, unfortunately, have to let you know that I have concerns about the legitimacy of Mr. Mark Starr, who gave you the California Department of Public Health report, given that he is a doctor of veterinary medicine, and that is outside of our scope. Okay, let's just finish up here.
No, Dr. Sumchi, that's it.
Oh, okay.
So 1 or 2 more sentences, and that's it.
Okay. All right. Could you just advance the slide one more time, then? Okay, I did just want to point out that it's very, very easy to understand the human health risk assessments. All you have to do is go to the record of decision of any operable unit or any of the parcels, And if the hazard index is over 1, then that is not protective of human health. If the cancer risk is greater than 1 in a million, that is not protective of human health. Parcel E has no areas on it that are protective of human health. And then why don't you just slip through the remainder of the slides? Just,
All right, that's it, Dr. Sumchi.
Okay.
All right, Dr. Sumchi, would you please take this document too? Because we cannot accept documents that are made, are really for other agencies.
You can't accept public comment here.
No, I can't. If that document is for a specific.
Is the representative of the California Department of Public Health here?
Okay, that would be more appropriate than for us to accept it. All right, thank you so much for your presentation.
I do want to apologize if things had gone as planned, then we would have been able to get through the full presentation. I also want to talk with you about being able to test via biomonitoring in the urine all of the major contaminants that are present, or most of the major contaminants that are present at the Point Shipyard. We're going to be doing that. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you.
All right, thank you very much again, Dr. Sumchi. And our next presenter is Daniel Hirsch, who is the retired director of the Program on Environmental and Nuclear Policy at the University of California, Santa Cruz. He is also president of the Committee to Bridge the Gap, CBG, a nonprofit organization that provides technical assistance to communities near contaminated nuclear sites. And Mr. Hirsch, when you are ready to present.
I'm just taking us a moment to sit down.
Okay. All right, Mr. Hirsch, we'd like to ask you to respond to the question I asked earlier of Dr. Sumchi, and that is, please state your qualifications and or educational background related to radiological testing and review of radiological data.
I taught at UCLA for about a decade, and then in 1983 transferred to UC Santa Cruz, where I was the founder and director of the Program on Nuclear Policy. Taught there until '89, where I then went to the Federation of American Scientists in Washington. Some years later, returning to UC Santa Cruz, where I was the director of the Program on Environmental Policy, which was requested by community members to do an independent assessment of the how close do I have to go? I'll do my best. Can you hear me?
Better.
Okay. So, director of the Program on Environmental Nuclear Policy, from which I retired a year and a half ago, and it was a request to that program that began the studies that I'll report to you on today.
All right, so may I just ask you one further question? In terms of, you have done policy review. Does that mean you're a scientist or a medical doctor?
I'm not a medical doctor. My specialty has been that integration between the technical and the policy, regulations and health.
Thank you.
Thank you. So many of you are going to have some difficulty seeing this, and I apologize. We'll do the best we can. So we were requested about 3 years ago to do a review, which we thought was going to take a few weeks. And I have to tell you what my bias was when we began. I thought we'd find absolutely nothing. I've spent much of my life looking at nuclear facilities that have been run by private industry that cut corners for profit reasons. I've looked at many nuclear facilities that were far from where the regulators were. But this was the US Navy. This was San Francisco. This was a Superfund site that was just a short cab ride from EPA's regional headquarters. And it was the last place where we thought we would find problems. Within a few weeks, we discovered that the cleanup standards that were being employed were decades old and vastly non-protective compared to the EPA current standards that they're required by law to be using. And that began a process of just looking at a number of other issues, which I'm going to report to you on right now. So let's hope this works. I'm going to have some trouble seeing. Can I move? I'm going to be, unfortunately, with my back to you a little bit. I apologize, but I don't know how else to do this. So here are the key points we're going to be dealing with. The Tetra Tech scandal, failure of the regulatory. Is there someplace you can put me where I can't do it? Maybe over here? Okay. Sorry. Here we go again. So, the radiological history that most people don't know about, the flawed testing methods that are unchanged in the retesting, Prop P and the Board of Supervisors resolution the following year requiring full cleanup, which has since been ignored. And here are the key points. Most of the site was never tested. Most radionuclides were never tested. Most tests couldn't detect the radionuclides that they were testing for at levels that would require cleanup. Cleanup standards are outdated and non-protective. And the policy changed very quietly some years ago from cleaning up the contamination to simply covering it up with a thin layer of soil or asphalt. This is one of the most amazing documents I've ever seen. You won't be able to read the last line, but this is an EPA document that says for parcel G, the regulatory agencies have concluded that 97% of the survey units are suspect. Look at the next chart. It's just astonishing. Again, these are EPA data. EPA was estimating, along with the state regulatory agencies, that only 3% of the measurements had no signs of falsification found in the data. It's just staggering. Here's for a different parcel. Only 10% were free of falsification. Here's another for additional parcels. Again, only 3%. In all my decades of dealing with such sites, I have never seen a level of falsification like this. It's absolutely astonishing. So how did this happen? Remember, this was not just Tetra Tech. It was not just a few supposed rogue employees. Navy contractor. This is a Superfund site, which means it's under US EPA regulation. And there's a federal facilities agreement, which means that state agencies are supposed to be bird-dogging this as well. All of them failed. This went on for years without them catching it. First point, the Tetra Tech problem is just the tip of the iceberg. What we discovered to our surprise is that the vast majority of the site was never sampled for radioactivity in the first place. To understand the history is vastly greater of radioactive activity than anyone in the public has been led to believe. We think that maybe there were a couple of ships from the nuclear weapons test that were berthed at Hunters Point that may have produced some contamination. It's vastly more than that. Beginning in 1946, 1 year after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, there was a series of tests in the Pacific. They went badly awry. They placed a whole series of naval vessels right around where the blast was supposed to occur. And you can see tiny ships right in front of the nuclear blast. Same thing here. Those blasts ended up contaminating hundreds of naval vessels. They had not realized, I don't understand how they could mistake this, that when you blow up a nuclear weapon underwater in the lagoon, it's going to send huge amounts of material from coral, sand, sediment high into the air, which had first been activated by the neutrons, making it radioactive. So that material, along with the fission products and the unburned plutonium and uranium, fell back on the ships. hundreds of ships. Here is one ship. You can just see a couple people right there, so you can see the extent of the mechanical damage. See it burning. That was from the first test. It then was damaged by the second test, which made it contaminated as well. They tried to decontaminate these ships at sea. This is a really powerful photograph. Look at the protective equipment they gave the sailors. They're in short sleeves and working with mops, trying to decontaminate these ships. They couldn't. They failed. It was impossible to decontaminate at sea. So an extraordinary decision was made to bring them back, some of them having to be towed back to Hunters Point, a community that was low income, largely African American, Hispanic, Asian, and decontaminate the ships there. Too dangerous to do at sea. Do it in San Francisco with this community. You have to understand one fundamental premise about radioactivity. You can't neutralize it with mechanical means. I can move it from the ships to Hunters Point, which is what happened. I can't make it disappear. They got it off the ships and onto Hunters Point. Okay? And this is the most important slide of all. That's how they did it. They sandblasted and steam cleaned over 80 radioactive ships over many years in the open air. And there's simply no way, if you're doing that, that stuff's going to stay there. The wind will carry it throughout much of Hunters Point. They took 600,000 gallons of radioactive fuel oil from these ships and burned them in boilers at Hunters Point. So the radioactivity was released from the stacks of those boilers. Numerous mechanisms whereby the contamination could be just released throughout the site. This particular carrier had been damaged, and they filled it with radioactive waste. They took it out to the Farallon Islands and dumped it with tens of thousands of barrels of radioactive waste. Hunters Point was used as the storage site for radioactive waste, not just for Hunters Point, but for Livermore, Lawrence Berkeley Lab, nuclear facilities throughout the region, stored, a lot of it leaking, eventually dumped in the ocean. These are animals that were experimented on at the nuclear test, but at Hunters Point, they had vast numbers of animals, from rats and guinea pigs all the way up to goats and burros. And these were injected with or radiated by nuclear materials. And so their defecation ends up getting out into the environment. Rain carries it, wind then blows the residue. And even the sailors and the workers were radioactive because they were working on these radioactive ships. So you had to have them scrubbed down and have their clothes carefully washed in nuclear laundries, and the contamination in the rinse water went down the drains, and those drains and those pipes leaked. So large amounts of radioactivity leaking subsurface into the soil. The Naval Radiological Defense Laboratory was one of the major activities at Hunters Point. Immense amounts of nuclear experimentation were done. They had to have licenses for some of their material. And these numbers mean nothing to you. But to someone like me, these numbers are absolutely astonishing. So this is the license for the amount of, strontium-90, for example, 60,000 curies. A curie, each one curie produces 37 billion disintegrations per second. Any one of those disintegrations, if it hits genetic material of a cell, can cause cancer or genetic effects in subsequent generations. We measure permissible concentrations of radioactivity in the environment in picocuries. That's millionths of a millionth of a curie. And they had 60,000 curies of strontium-90. It acts like calcium, goes to the bone, causes bone cancer and leukemia. 15,000 curies of cobalt, 60, over 1 ton of depleted uranium, over 2,000 grams of plutonium-239. To put this in perspective, 60,000 curies of strontium-90 could contaminate more than 10 trillion tons of soil at EPA's default Superfund preliminary remediation goal level. The depleted uranium could contaminate more than 200 million metric tons. And to put the 2,000 grams of plutonium into perspective, 1 millionth of an ounce, if inhaled, will cause cancer with a virtual 100% statistical certainty. These are not tiny amounts, and I have to be clear, much of the radioactivity at Hunters Point doesn't show up on these licenses. All that stuff with those naval ships, that isn't in these licenses. So the point is that the entire site has significant potential for contamination. This stuff was airborne. The sandblasting, the steam cleaning, the burning of the contaminated fuel oil. So many of these mechanisms are mechanisms that can contaminate a wide area. However, the Navy, simply by waving a magic wand, declared 90%, roughly, of Hunters Point to be non-impacted and therefore not needing to have samples taken of the radioactivity. They just declared it couldn't be radioactive. They did that by looking at historical documents and say, we don't have a historical document of a particular radioactive material used in that particular building, so we're going to declare it clean. You never do that. EPA, when it did a study of Santa Susana, the facility I wasted 40 years of my life trying to get cleaned up in Southern California, there they simply said, we can't trust the records. We have to look everywhere and find if it's contaminated or not. And they found contamination in all sorts of places where the operator said it couldn't be. But the Navy simply declared 90% by fiat to not be contaminated, non-impacted, including Parcel A, about which there's so much controversy, and therefore didn't take samples. Take a look at that. They looked at 883 sites. 792 of them they declared by fiat to be non-impacted and didn't look at it. Roughly 90%. This is a Navy document. The yellow are the areas they declared non-impacted. The green and that kind of orange, they declared potentially impacted. So in rough terms, that yellow never got sampled. Another Navy document. So you'll see these narrow lines. Those are the sewer lines that they did test, and some buildings that they tested and building footprints. The rest of it, no need to sample, not sampled. We don't really know what's there. So the entire Tetra Tech scandal has to do with fabricating those places they did measure. Bad enough, but we don't know anything about the places they didn't test. This pattern continued. So they had a model called the spill model, which said the contamination would only occur in places where they knew a radioactive material was used and it was spilled, and it would be localized in that area. And as they were doing their Parcel B work, they discovered the spill model was wrong. They found ubiquitous contamination. Contamination in all sorts of places they didn't expect. This will be very important as we get into how they shifted their remedy. The same thing occurred with the radionuclides of concern. Their own documents, I'm sorry you can't read all this, but this shows over 100 radionuclides that the Navy identified as having been used at Hunters Point. They narrowed that down to several dozen radionuclides of concern at Hunters Point, based on their half-lives. But then, when it came to actually measuring, they limited the measurements to 3 or 4. So roughly 90% of the site wasn't tested, and roughly 90% of radionuclides weren't tested in the areas that they did test for. It gets worse. Of those 4, most of the testing they did was blind to 2 of them. They did gamma scans. Plutonium is an alpha emitter. The gamma scan can't see it. Strontium-90 is a pure beta emitter. The gamma scan can't see it. And by their own documents, they can't, with their gamma scan, see the cesium at the levels that require cleanup. So they ended up looking basically for 1 radionuclide, and that's because they created a cleanup level so high for it that it was almost astronomical. Really important. Under Superfund, the Navy is required to use standards that are consistent with EPA's current Superfund standards. Those are embodied in what are called the Preliminary Remediation Goals, PRGs. I've been trained by the EPA in how to use the PRGs. They're complicated, but in some sense they're very simple. EPA has some default values, and you're not supposed to go off those default values unless you have some very strong reasons to do so. So here are the comparisons that you will see. Let's just take an example of plutonium-239. The value that the Navy is using is 421 times weaker than the default EPA PRGs. The values for radium are 897 times weaker, The thorium-232, 971 times weaker. How did that happen? Because they used PRGs from decades ago rather than using the current ones. My students and I found that in 2 weeks of looking when we first started this. What does that mean? You can just see. They should be leaving behind just that amount that the dots represent. But they're leaving 420, 897, and 971 times more by using these weak cleanup standards. What does that mean in human terms? It means, again using EPA's calculations, that the levels that they're leaving would allow you the equivalent, let us say for the radium, of 49 chest x-rays a year. Essentially every week of your life, from inception to death, you'd be getting an additional chest x-ray you didn't ask for, weren't informed for, where there was no medical benefit for. It's just a graphic that shows you the equivalent number of chest x-rays. Their buildings, same problem. They're supposed to use the EPA's building PRG calculator. What did they use? A 1974 guidance document from an agency that no longer exists, the Atomic Energy Commission, that was never designed for health purposes. And take a look at how it fails to meet the EPA's PRGs. So it is hundreds of times weaker, less protective than the EPA's building PRGs. And based on risk, if they had levels allowed under the Navy standards, the EPA risk calculator says 1 in every 380 people would get cancer. No one's claiming that was what the cancer risk is. That's from the actual contamination. But that's what the risk would be from the cleanup levels. Okay? You're supposed to aim at 1 in a million. Never more than 1 in 10,000. And they have risks vastly higher than that. This is for external radiation. You can see 3,000 times weaker standards than the EPA's default building standards for external radiation. This is for the number of chest x-ray equivalents from the buildings again. You see large numbers of chest x-rays being in a building that Navy says would have been cleaned up to their ancient standards that they're not supposed to be using. How many times higher risk? Again, thousands of times higher risk than the EPA goal. And the number of chest x-rays is, in some cases, hundreds of chest x-rays a year. Year after year. Living here, you shouldn't be getting even one chest x-ray that you didn't sign up for, that didn't have a medical reason for it. Altogether, if you add the internal and the external exposures for the buildings, 1 in 37 people will get cancer at the permissible levels of exposure that the Navy has been using for its buildings. This is just astonishing. And how EPA didn't catch it, how DTSC, DPH didn't catch it, is still beyond me. Next issue. They've been inflating background. There's radioactivity everywhere. You can't get away from it. There's uranium and the uranium decay products in soil, in building materials, and so on. So you don't clean up below background. You clean up to background or to the risk level. But they've been inflating the background value to do less cleanup. So they've been taking their background measurements. Background is supposed to be, what would be the level if there had never been a radioactive enterprise at Hunters Point, right? So if the site is all potentially contaminated, where do you take your background? Not in the middle of the potentially contaminated site, but that's exactly what they've been doing. So they have been taking background measurements in exactly the places that are potentially contaminated. You need to do it away from the facility, not in the midst of the facility. They're inflating the background. This one was quite lovely. The retesting plan that they had for parcel G said this building was admittedly impacted. And so this they say is contaminated, that room. They were going to take the sample from a room a few feet away. Who does something like that unless they're trying to reduce the cleanup? They've now backed off of that and said they're going to instead take the measurements from other buildings very close by. You don't do that. Again, background locations. in the midst of the Superfund site. You don't do that. Here's the Parcel G retesting plan. So here I got to tell you what's really worried me. Tetra Tech fabricated measurements. The US government has filed suit. It says it's not just a handful of rogue employees, but this was done at the direction of the company. Hundreds of millions of dollars of taxpayer dollars wasted and risks the public created thereby. You need, for the Navy and the agencies, to say, we're going to fix this. We're going to not repeat any of those mistakes. Yet the Navy's retesting plan is as flawed as was the Tetra Tech plan, and in some ways even more. Their draft retesting plan asserted that yes, they think there were some errors made in the measurements, that 80% of the soil that was deemed contaminated really wasn't, and the site is too clean. It's just astonishing. They similarly have weakened the cleanup standards even further illegally. It has to be based on the record of decision. They've changed them to push them higher, weaker. They rely heavily still on the gamma scans, which can't detect alpha or beta radionuclides. It can only detect radium and cesium, not at the cleanup level. They're still only looking for 3 to 4 radionuclides of concern, and they inflate background. Just a tiny example of what they're doing. The cleanup standard has a tiny footnote, and I've taught my students to always read the footnotes. The footnote says that they are taking these cleanup levels and pushing them over, adding background to it, which is not permitted in the record of decision for anything except radium. Parcel A, found suitable to transfer 15 years ago, based on the claim that no activities could have contaminated parcel A and they therefore didn't need to test it. Now, that has been called into question. California Department of Public Health has come in to do a limited gamma scan. Those words are very important. Limited gamma scan. No soil samples, no measurements for alpha, beta. A quick scan just for gamma. They can't even see almost any of the gamma radionuclides at the levels that would require cleanup. Very easy to walk around and say, okay, it's clean, we can now release it. In 2002, EPA went around with this kind of ice cream van on the streets with a gamma scanner. It's for show. It can't see almost anything, and it didn't see anything. Look at where they went. They couldn't go off-road, so they could only go on those little narrow paths. The DPH parcel A scan, as I say, took no soil samples and can't see alpha like plutonium, beta like strontium, or the gamma at the levels requiring cleanup for almost any gamma radionuclides. And this is what they've done. See that little device that they're pulling around by the golf course? And then they have handheld devices. This is for show. It's like someone wandering around with a blindfold and saying they didn't see anything. They're saying they didn't detect anything, but they can't detect it because they can't detect alpha or beta or most of the gamma. Even so, they found this uranium source. And you've heard a lot of claims saying it's not very radioactive. Here are their actual numbers, their numbers. 800 millirem per year at the soil surface. That's the equivalent of 400 chest x-rays a year. When it was buried, and when it was dug up, it was 30,000 millirem a year. This is vastly above EPA limits for exposure. It shouldn't be there. They had declared it couldn't be there, right? The area was supposed to be unimpacted. If they stumbled across this, the question is what else is there that they haven't seen that they would see if they took soil samples, measured for alpha, measured for beta, looked at the rest of the parcel. So here is the next troubling concern. When they began to do the cleanup of parcel B, the Navy promised that it would clean up the contamination that was above the cleanup levels. I've identified for you already that those cleanup levels are woefully weak. We know that many measurements were fabricated. But what you don't know is that part of the way through the parcel B cleanup, the Navy discovered that the contamination was much more widespread than they had thought. The spill model didn't work. It wasn't just in small little locations. It's throughout the parcel. And radioactivity was in places they thought it couldn't be. and it was going to be much more expensive to clean it up than they thought. So they very quietly changed the cleanup remedy, not just for parcel B, but for the rest of the site, from cleaning up the contamination to covering it up. Covering it with a 2-foot layer of soil or 4 inches of asphalt. Now, I don't know how many of you would want to live on top of a site that is still contaminated, and your sole protection is 2 feet of soil or 4 inches of asphalt. And remember, people are allowed to grow things in it that they can eat. They have to have a raised bed, which is about 8 inches, makes no difference. The roots go far deeper than 2 or 3 feet. You can have all sorts of other plants that bring the contaminants up to the surface. 1,000 different ways in which 2 feet of soil is meaningless. Just meaningless from a public health standpoint. And then remember that the whole plan is to tear it all up because the area is supposed to be developed. Digging through it to put in foundations for buildings. And there's just no way you can do that without spreading the contamination even further. So what's intriguing to me from a policy standpoint is that this is in direct violation of San Francisco official policy. The policy, both by a vote of the people and by a vote of the Board of Supervisors, making it official policy, is that the site should be cleaned up to the most protective EPA standard, one that would allow for unrestricted release without requiring the presence of any physical barriers, right? You clean it up to those EPA PRGs so you can live there without having to have some kind of a cover, a cap, a restriction of what you can do. That's the official policy that was passed in Proposition P. And let me just read you a little section. 86.4% of those who voted in favor of it. While the federal government is required by law to clean up the shipyard, the Navy says it will cost too much to do a thorough job. This is the language of the proposition, not my words. Instead, the Navy plans to leave behind so much contamination that will increase the risk for cancer resulting from exposure to the property, requiring the construction of barriers and the restriction of future land use. Hunters Point Shipyard must be cleaned to a level which would enable the unrestricted use of the property, the highest standard for cleanup established by the US EPA. That was the vote of the people. You can say, well, maybe that never became official policy of the city and county. Well, here's the last part of the Prop P. It is the policy of the people of the city and the county of San Francisco that we oppose increasing the risk for cancer as a result of using lower standards for cleanup. The shipyard should be cleaned up to a level that will enable unrestricted use. That means no cover, no land use restrictions. It's safe no matter what you do going on. So the following year, the Board of Supervisors passed this resolution. Whereas, although the federal government is required by law to clean up the shipyard, the Navy says it will cost too much money to do a thorough job. Instead, the Navy plans to leave behind so much contamination that the property may expose occupants and visitors to an unacceptable risk of cancer unless the Navy imposes legal restrictions on land use and constructs physical barriers. And whereas the U.S. government should be held to the highest standards of accountability for its actions, whereas the U.S. Navy has demonstrated that it is not committed to responsible site management or cleanup, and many in Bayview Hunters Point community believe the department's disdain for its duties in this neighborhood stems from the racial makeup of its residents. Not my words, the words of the official position of the Board of Supervisors of San Francisco. Whereas the Bayview community wishes the shipyard to be cleaned to a level which would enable the unrestricted use of the property, the highest standard for cleanup established by the EPA, whereas 87% of the voters passed this resolution opposing the lowering of the standards, whereas environmental remedies that require future owners to maintain physical barriers should not be used. Resolved, the board hereby declares that Prop P shall be the official policy of the city regarding the remediation of the shipyard and sets forth the standard of remediation acceptable to the community. Further, the board urges all participating city agencies, including the Department of Health, Environment Planning, DA, and Redevelopment, to ensure full federal compliance with Prop P. It hasn't happened. The city and county have not objected to the switch in cleanup standards from the most protected to among the least protected, to the reliance on physical barriers, to the reliance on institutional control. Conclusion. I have 1 minute and 9 seconds. Nuclear activities that could contaminate Hunters Point were far more extensive and publicly recognized. These radioactivities could produce widespread contamination. Nevertheless, the Navy simply declared 90% of Hunters Point non-impacted and didn't sample those areas at all. What limited areas were tested for only a handful of the dozens of radionuclides of concern. 90 to 97% of survey units that were tested are suspected of falsification. There are essentially no data to demonstrate Hunters Point Shipyard safety. The Navy's cleanup standards are extremely outdated and grossly less protective than EPA's Superfund goals. The DPH gamma scans can't detect alpha or beta radionuclides at all, can't detect most gamma. No soil samples have been taken. Nonetheless, they found a source where they previously said none could exist. The Navy's retesting plans for the rest of Hunters Point are similarly flawed. They quietly reversed the commitment to cleaning up the contamination instead of covering it, despite the vote of the people. And unless there's dramatic change of course, serious questions will remain about the safety of Hunters Point Shipyard. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. All right, I'm going to ask the CAC members if you have any questions for either Dr. Sumchi or Mr. Hirsch.
I would like to know if we can have a copy of your report.
Yes, I forwarded to your staff the actual PDF and links to the 3 reports we have already done.
I'm sorry, just a second. Okay, please. Elise.
Madam Chair.
Wait just a minute.
So I just want to thank everyone for their patience. Again, we're going to ask that this side of the wall, because of fire hazard, be cleared. If I have business cards on the back, if you want a copy of this presentation or Dr. Sumchi's presentation, you can email me. If I'm out of cards, just see me after the meeting, and we'll make sure we'll get those links to you. Okay.
Thank you very much. All right, so Mrs. Mixon, you would like to
Ollie Mixon for the record. My concern and my question to you, that the shipyard closed in 1974. Can you tell me what year you started working on this project?
We began 3 years ago.
When?
3 years ago.
3 years ago. Okay. 2007, 2008,
2006.
wait, 2009, 2010 to the present. It appears that none, or just a few, a percentage of this information has come to us. Now, it's just flooding that all this contamination is out here. So, can you explain to me why, if you started 3 years ago, which was 2016, 15, 14, somewhere in there, that you are just not coming to this board and giving this wonderful information?
You're not going to like the answer. We wanted to finish our reports within a few months of when we began the research. We found that the Navy and the other agencies were frankly extremely recalcitrant in releasing the necessary data for us to do the review. We couldn't in conscience publish until we had that data, and every time we asked the Navy, asked the Toxics Agency specific information, we were stonewalled. I had to go to a group in Washington that sues using the Freedom of Information Act to pry some of this data out. The fact that you now know that up to 97% of the survey units were fabricated is because I went to a group in Washington and had them submit FOIAs, Freedom of Information Act requests, because neither the Navy nor the EPA had voluntarily released that information. So I had a moral obligation not to release stuff till I was certain of it. We released our first 2 studies about 6 months ago, the 3rd study a few months ago, and we have a 4th study to come out relatively soon.
But my last question, Chair, is that Thank you for your information and your presentation. Well, do you live in the city?
I live in Santa Cruz.
You live in Santa Cruz? Thank you very much. Thank
All
you.
right, now, CAC members, do you have any additional questions? Okay,
I just want to state.
yes, Mrs. Benson.
Dr. Nice, over the years, we've gone over the same information in a different form. Being a country girl, I know what the intent from Prop P was. Can you imagine anybody in this room being alive when you thoroughly clean up all of the shipyard?
Yes,
How many years would it take?
let me be clear about that. If Tetra Tech hadn't fabricated 15 years worth of measurements, if the oversight had been efficient, you would have been able to clean the site up in a reasonable time. Now it's going to take decades longer.
What would be reasonable?
I think in the 15 years they've been working on it, they could have done it. In the 15 years they've been working on it, they could have done it. Now it's going to take decades longer because it got done badly and has to be redone.
Now, the reason I raised that question, it was through this committee that the decision was made to do the counting. So, I would like for somebody to tell us what would be the best way to do that. So the capping, according to those presenters, is not going to do it. So tell us what is the best way of doing this without waiting. I'm 86. I won't be here 50 years from now. I won't be here 50 years. So, I mean, you know, I would like to see it in somebody in this room's lifetime.
The only answer is to remove the contamination, not to cover it. Covering will not protect people. Certainly not 2 feet of soil or 4 inches of asphalt. So it should be removed, as the original promise was, and as Prop P and the board policy, Board of Supervisors policy says it should be. You remove it so people are not in proximity to the contamination.
And in my own little investigation, there is a solution whereby you use like soda or some sort of combination to clean the ground. Has anybody looked into that?
I think you may be referring to trying to remediate some of the chemicals.
Yeah.
Some chemicals you can neutralize through other chemical processes. You can also, for some radioactive and chemical contamination, plant phytoremediation plants, plants that suck the contamination up, cut the plant, dispose of that as waste. So there are methods in which you can neutralize chemicals and you can concentrate the radioactivity. But that's not what's being done here. We're just covering it.
But could we do that here?
In some places you could do that. There are some of these chemicals which you could degrade through active chemical processes. And again, that would be very worth looking at.
Thank you.
Yes, Mr. Laughlin, CAC member.
My question is, are you basing everything that I'm asking whether what you're saying is based on the EPA recommendations that you had up there, or on some absolute zero number?
Right. I'm not proposing that it be cleaned up to background. I'm not proposing that it be cleaned up to some standard that's not EPA's. The law, CERCLA, Superfund law, says that a Superfund site must be cleaned up consistent with EPA's Superfund guidance. And our fundamental point is that it's not. What we propose is that it be so. Very simple.
All right, Mr. Bell.
Yes, there was some years ago that I submitted some information from a company out of Texas that does remediation. And I have that information and I'll try to find it. But for years, I've been saying no to the covering, that they need to dig that hole, all this stuff up, and see what the contamination is. I never believed in that drilling that they said, that Lennar and them said that they did. So it's obvious now that there's some tremendous deception that has been going on. And I just want to say this, and I've said it, last year sometime, that somehow or another, we need to get the mayor of the Board of Supervisors to get 5 Point to accept the liability that Lennar has messed up on. For all of you that don't know, Lennar's assets have been transferred. 51% of their assets have been transferred to 5 Point. So in viewing this information, we're screwed.
So, Pastor Bill.
No, I'm not going to stop because I'm not finished. I don't mean to disrespect you, Dr. Honeycutt. I'm not finished. Because the reality is, if you understand corporate law, the reason why these companies, big companies, set up these subsidiaries is for this exact reason, that when everything goes hooky-crooky, they bankrupt the corporation, quote, Lennar, and move on with another corporation. Now, that's all I got to say. You can check me out if you want to, but, and I've said this before, so it's nothing new. It's in the public record.
All right. So, are all the CAC members finished with asking questions? Ms. Smith.
I just want to say that we want to be clear, and I want to thank you for stating that this was something that was brought to San Francisco, and San Francisco did vote for Proposition P to pass, and this is what the results is. So at the end of the day, they did the proper thing. They brought it to us with good full information, and San Francisco chose to cap it instead of cleaning it 100%.
Can I ask a question? When did San Francisco do it? The last board resolution we've seen says the opposite.
Right.
Excuse that.
All right, so are there any additional CAC member questions? All right, now, what I'd like to do, since we do have the regulators in the room, and they are ready to respond to Dr. Sumchi's and Mr. Hirsch's presentation, and since I only have 2 speaker cards representing interest from the general public, I'm going to take those 2 individuals, and then I am going to ask Derek Robinson of the Navy to make a presentation because we need further information. We also have Angeles Herrera here from the EPA. We have Dr. Tomas Aragon, who is here. He's a health officer for the city and county of San Francisco. I saw Amy Brownell back there from DPH. So let's have a full discussion of all of this, all right, while we're here. So let's call on, and if you stand up here, folks, those of you who would like to ask questions, the limit is 3 minutes for you to stand up and ask a question. Okay, you won't be here for 15 minutes asking a question. Michelle Pierce, BBHP Advocates.
So, and my question specifically concerns Dr. Hirsch's presentation. However, he can't answer it. My biggest question is, given everything that he has said, given the $1 billion that the city and the federal government have invested in this cleanup, given the hundreds of $1 billion that the developer has raised for this project, and the fact that all of that needs to be started over again, is this project economically feasible to take place? Or does it make sense for us to plant and allow nature to take its course. Because based on what he said, based on my background as a biochemist, we are going to need to go back and undo the capping that has already taken place for a huge investment. Then we're going to have to actually go back and characterize everything that's there. Then we're going to have to create a new plan. You guys, much respect, are going to have to go back and create a new plan that it took the RAB 16 years to create in the first place. And then we'll get to the cleaning up. And then they will be able to build. In the meantime, everybody who lives on Parcel A, whose houses before October of 2014 were pushing up into the multi-millions, are going to have to be compensated or protected in some way. Is this project still economically feasible?
All right, we do have a response for you in terms of your question, and thank you very much for your question. I'm going to ask Mrs. Ollie Nixon to speak to that concern of yours.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ollie Nixon, for the record. To the young lady that just spoke, our Congressman Nancy Pelosi was here in the middle of 2018 about the same area that we're talking about right now. The Navy was there, the EPA, so on and so forth. They are looking into this. And this is why I asked, to you, young lady, this is why I asked the prior speaker, how many years have you been working? If we know some things, and those of you that has the knowledge, we sitting on this committee, some of us don't have the knowledge. We just been around long enough to know what the Navy has said, what the Navy did. My concern is still, why are you just coming forward? This happened in 2004, up to the present. And you're here now, giving all this information, which is good information. But Senator Nancy Pelosi and the Navy is now looking into it. There's nothing we can do right here. I'm talking about this committee until they come back to us.
All right, so the next individual who would like to speak is John Smith of PHTA.
Excuse me, he's not from PHTA.
Put that down.
He put it down. He didn't.
Tenant Association.
He's from the Potrero Terrace Tenant Association.
I'm new. Hello. I'm new at this. Hello, everybody. I'm glad to see you. I just would like to ask, is this like a Chernobyl? Secondly, who has gone to jail over this? Because everything sounds premeditated. And why don't you just close up shop? Because you talk about stuff, just speak of plutonium with a 3,000-year shelf life. How are you going to clean up something like that?
Why are you asking him? He's not the problem.
I'm asking whoever,
All right,
to
so,
whom it may concern.
okay, so you want to respond to that, Mr.
Through with that.
It's not a Chernobyl. Chernobyl released mega curies of radioactivity and contaminated much of Europe. It's not good. It's not a safe situation, but it's not a Chernobyl. Plutonium has a 24,000-year half-life, therefore toxic. I know, it's worse than you thought. It's toxic, therefore, for 500,000 years. We haven't had a U.S. government for more than a few hundred years, recorded civilization for a few thousand. These are extraordinarily long-life materials.
The military, yeah.
But at the same time, cleaning stuff up is not rocket science. It is moving it from an area where people can be exposed to it to a place where you can more readily isolate it. So it could have been done right. It can still be done right. And it needs to be done right because some people will get hurt from that contamination if we don't clean it up.
third question, who's going to jail? Or so
Two
far?
individuals from Tetra Tech have gone to jail so far. Always the lower level folks, right?
Yes, right.
All right, thank you, Mr. Hirsch, for answering that. Thank you very much. All right, so one other person has submitted a card, and then after that, I'd like to get the Navy up here. And then we're gonna go right down the line with the other regulators, okay? So, Karen Pierce, would you please step up and ask your question?
This is just a point of clarification. I'm Karen Pierce. I work for the San Francisco Department of Public Health, but I'm not speaking on behalf of the department. I'm speaking as a former member of the RAB, of the shipyard group that raised these issues back then, that raised these very issues, that reported that we knew that the documents were being falsified. Okay? This is not something new, and you can go to the public library and you can find that information. It's on the record. So I just want to be sure, because I've been around as long as you guys, I want to be sure that we are correct in how we are characterizing what has gone on here.
Thank you. I believe there's another RAB member, former RAB member, who is here. Is Commissioner Linda Richardson back there? Did you want to speak to this issue? No. Okay, thank you. All right, so now, folks, could you bring all of these yellow slips up at the same time? Does anyone else want to speak on this issue? Okay. Would you fill in one of these yellow, Elise or somebody, get her a yellow form, because I'd like for all of you to ask your questions, okay? So we can get this done, all right? And I don't want to miss anyone back there. Okay, so as she gets the yellow form and fills it in, Darcy Blake, Shipyard homeowner, please. Thank you. Darcy? Darcy Blake, Shipyard homeowner. Oh, good.
Hello. I have a question that might be of interest to anyone who's thought of trying to sell their home at the shipyard. And that is that there is apparently no funding right now from the banks. A realtor told me that some of the banks are waiting until a PERS report comes out, PERS, and I was wondering when we could expect that coming out.
We don't have that information, but I don't know about a PERS report. I thought it was a, is Amy Brownell back there?
Right here.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I think you're referring to the CDPH
report. Is that the one for Parcel A? Is that the one?
Yeah.
Right, and it was supposed to be coming out within a short period of time. Is that correct, Amy? But we haven't seen it yet. Okay, so there is, I noticed you probably saw the article in the Chronicle about the lending situation, and that they were waiting for the report from that agency so that they could review whether they will reopen.
It sounds like it's going to be like a shark fest. When the report comes out, then everyone will fund if they like the results.
Well, we'll all have to look and see what happens as a result of this. Thank you, though, for your question. Okay, so we have one more before we get the Navy presentation. Gloria Berry, a Navy veteran. She has a question for the doctor and professor.
Hi, Doctor. Thank you for your presentation. Like she said, I'm a Navy veteran. I was on a nuclear ship actually here at the shipyard, and I have a mysterious illness. I take chemotherapy for a reason that's idiopathic. They have no idea. You have a kit you were talking about. Is there more you can explain about that kit and how we can test to see if we are actually contaminated? And also the professor, I wanted to ask if in your research includes water testing out here.
Okay, so let me help you with that, please. Would you please talk with her offline? Okay,
Oh, I would like.
because
So the rest of us can't find out?
No, I would like to know
you
too.
can,
Though.
but can you meet afterwards so we can, because we have a lot of business, additional business. How long would that take you to just?
Let me just take a minute.
Okay.
Biomonitoring is a new science that allows you to test human body fluids, everything from blood to urine to hair to breast milk, for chemicals of concern. And these chemicals are called biomarkers. And there is a simple test that we are preparing to offer. In fact, on Wednesday, I'm going to be seeing a worker who is a non-smoker who has throat cancer and is embroiled in litigation. This is Genova Diagnostics Comprehensive Urine Element Profile. It tests for 35 major chemicals of concern and radionuclides of concern at the shipyard, including lead, arsenic, mercury, copper, strontium-90, uranium, cesium, thorium, virtually most of your major chemicals of concern can be tested for in a simple urinalysis that is mailed in a prepaid envelope to a laboratory. There's a 24-hour turnover. And we are seeking some support for instituting a biomonitoring program for residents living within a 1-mile radius of the Hunters Point Shipyard, a federal Superfund site, and we've gotten an enormous amount of support. I met this weekend with Dr. Talmadge King, who is the Dean of the School of Medicine and the Vice Chair of Academic Affairs at UCSF, and he's interested in helping us, and we have also garnered support from other people.
Dr. Sumchi.
Sure. Let me just say one other thing that's important, please. I'm going to be meeting with Supervisor Shaman Walton. I don't know if he's still here in February. Proposition P is not an ordinance. It is not enforceable. It doesn't have teeth. It was a public policy measure that was, prepared by the Board of Supervisors and passed. But until you have an ordinance, a law, then you cannot enforce this measure. And what I would propose to Supervisor Walton is that we take Proposition P to the next level, make it enforceable, use standards that are current and acceptable, and we'll probably have to get you involved in that. And I think that we can build consensus around a law that makes the Navy adhere to a cleanup standard that allows for unrestricted use under the federal Superfund law. Community acceptance is one of the elements.
You know what? That is shameful to blood.
We're sorry, folks, but we can't be here all night. So that's why we have limitations. When you go to the board of supervisors, you have the same thing. So we are sorry, but you can speak with these individuals afterwards.
No kidding.
All right, so now, I'm sorry, Richard, did you want to?
She answered my question.
She answered.
About the water question?
She had a question on water.
Oh, water.
We don't do it going out in the field, but we've reviewed the testing that's been done. There's basically a decision that's been made to not clean up the groundwater, and I'm troubled by that. So
You
the
said
water is
to not?
contaminated, but it's not to be cleaned up.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Hirsch. All right, so it's now time to hear from the Navy, and we have Derek Robinson here. Mr. Robinson, could you step up, please? Excuse me, I hear some noise out there.
That's me talking.
Okay, well then please eliminate that.
Oh, no, I'll do that.
Yeah, that's
Freedom of
fine.
speech is eliminated.
Okay. Should I be over there or
Yes.
over here?
Well, I'm standing
Wherever you want to be.
Yeah, I'll stand over here.
Okay.
All right, thank you all for.
I'm getting ready
Here,
to
stand.
go.
I'm gonna go right over here. Yeah, there you go. All right. Thank you for the opportunity, CAC board, for talking today. It's not just myself here. I have brought several experts in the field that we all have our 3-minute statements that we're going to go through, just like any other community member. My name is Derek Robinson.
Excuse me. Yes, I can. Just escort yourself out. Thank you. So sad.
Ready?
I'm sorry, Derek. Yes.
Okay. My name is Derek Robinson. I'm the BRAC Environmental Coordinator for the Navy for the Hunters Point Shipyard. I've got a 20 years plus experience in the environmental field. I'm a chemical engineer. I have my professional engineering license in civil engineering. To say that I disagree would be with a lot of the information presented tonight would be an understatement. I'll just tell you that right up front. The experts that I have here tonight, we all have our 3-minute statements to talk about some of the information you've heard. But it's my role as a BRAC Environmental Coordinator to ensure that this property is safe after we're done with it. For the people who live here now and into the future, the people who use this property. And I'd like to talk a little bit about how we do that. So, first off, I work with professionals that have been in this field their entire career. They're ultimately qualified. They are the people you should be listening to when we talk about these things. They're going to be talking today about the cleanup goals. Well, we'll show you a table on the screen. Talking about where we sampled, why we did that. Talking about the amount of contamination here at the base. Secondly, everything we do, every decision we make in concert with regulatory agencies. Okay? The regulatory agencies are the ones who say what's safe and what's not. They know. They're here tonight representing. Don't listen to other people who have their own interpretation of laws and regulations. Listen to the regulatory agencies. And I can tell you right now, every document that we have produced, they concur on. So we don't go out and that's actually my last point. Our program is 100% transparent. A lot of the information you saw here tonight was all stuff that we produced, that we made available to the public. We don't do anything before we put it on paper and regulatory agencies concur on it. There's also a public process where we make the documents available to the public to review, to provide formal comment. There's a formal comment period on all of our decision making. So I hope you get out of this today that first off, a lot of what you've seen, I don't believe to be reality. That's not what I understand. We have several people that are going to be talking. Please give them your attention. It's my job to ensure the site's safe, and I do that by working with state and federal regulations. Everything we do, in accordance with state and federal regulations, I work with professionals that know, that are the experts. They really are. Their whole career is spent doing environmental work. And finally, we put it all out there for you, to the public. Make sure you see what we're doing and you can review it. So thank you again for the opportunity today. I'd like to turn this over to one of the experts I brought here tonight.
Mr. Robinson, the entire Parsley shoreline is contaminated. This is a Navy map. Everything in gray here
Dr. Sumchi, please sit down. Dr. Sumchi, Dr. Sumchi, stop it. I'd be treating you like a child.
Thank you. Parsley 2 is contaminated, and the Navy is addressing it. So if I could get, Craig, would you mind coming up first, please?
Good evening, and thanks for having me here. I'm Dr. Craig Bias. I am the owner and principal of a consulting company called REMWorks in San Antonio, Texas. Dr. Honeycutt, to answer your question, I'm a radiation physicist. I have 25 years in this field in the oversight of radiological protection programs. I have graduate degrees in environmental engineering, radiation physics, and radiation chemistry, and I'm also a certified health physicist. Sorry.
Please let him speak.
Well, the question up front was to state my qualifications in this area. Okay, so I'm trying to do that. Thank you. I've been working at Hunters Point since 2013, and I'm currently the Senior Technical Advisor for the independent oversight that's going on for radiological activities here. So thank you to the committee and the Bayview residents for having me here. I'm going to talk about the cleanup goals. They've been addressed and they've been, I guess, characterized as non-effective and ancient and outdated. So yes, they date back to 2006, but the Navy does a review every 5 years of those to ensure that they're still protected. And I'm going a little off topic here, but for every report that's done, there's also a risk assessment associated with it to evaluate what the actual conditions are, not just what the cleanup goals were. So what is the risk associated with this building or site when the measurements are complete, and especially upon transfer? So my role in all of this is to ensure that the Navy activities are protective of human health and the environment, and that means you folks. Okay? And really, as a scientist, my role is to ensure that the data, the results, the methods are defensible, that they're peer-reviewed, okay, and that they're coordinated with the other regulatory agencies. So the cleanup goals themselves, I began reviewing in earnest in coordination with EPA Region 9 and US EPA in early 2017 using EPA's own calculators. So much of the information that was presented tonight about the risk associated with these cleanup goals, as stated, were based on EPA default values in their models. Well, the EPA states that you start out using these goals to assess your program. You start looking at what efforts would be required if you clean up to their default levels. But the reality is, per EPA policy under the Circle program, okay, what you want to do is start looking at how much money would it take to start collecting site-specific data. So all the defaults are really based on, right, residents that live in Minnesota, don't have your weather conditions, don't have your soil topography or geology, okay, and they're very conservative for a reason. But you want to know, okay, what the risks are based on your local area conditions and based on the radiological concentrations, if any, in your site, not somebody else's site. So the path going forward is to collect additional information so that you can refine those models. So I've been running these models. Oh, that's our slide. So just as an example, okay, using almost all EPA defaults, except changing the weather so that it's not Minneapolis and it's San Francisco, okay, and taking out the consumption of produce, okay, which is a deed restriction here. Now that's only produce as your primary source of fruits and vegetables. Thank you. Okay. Sorry about that. Should have spoken up earlier. I can speak up. Okay. I mean, it's very clear to us in the soil models using EPA's methods that the current cleanup standards are very protective. Okay. We've run these for buildings, and they're still protective for buildings. However, we could be here all night talking about how complex the models are, and EPA themselves are not resolved on how to use those models for Hunters Point. So I work with the Superfund national expert closely on this, as well as the local region, and it's being reviewed as part of the 5-year review, and it will be published. Okay.
When? Thank you.
I think I got it.
Can you have your next speaker? Okay, we have Alex Lopez.